Thank you very much for having me here today at the Biohacker Summit. I'm really happy to be here and to share my experience in Antarctica with you all. To start off with my presentation, I'd just like to show you a short clip about my experience down there to give you an idea of what Concordia is all about.
At the end of the world, there is a place so hostile that no country owns it. Explorers call it the last great wilderness on Earth. In artists, it has inspired visions of beauty and of horror, with its stunning vistas and mountains of madness. Here, when winter comes, it lasts for months of unbroken darkness. The air is too thin to breathe normally and drops to minus 80 degrees Celsius. No animals can survive. There is no indigenous population. Anyone trapped here when winter comes is out of reach, as no access or rescue is possible at all, be it by ship, airplane, or helicopter. On life or death, there is no escape from the ice. This is isolation. It is like you are on another world. Join the story of a lifetime. The story of taking the next step towards the stars. Of leaving this world and gaining another one. For by surviving here at the end of the world, we learn how to survive beyond our home planet Earth. Such as on the moon. Or on Mars. The future of human spaceflight is here and now, and it is real. Be a part of the adventure.
Hi, my name's Beth Healey, medical doctor for ESA at Concordia Station over the past year. Join me on my adventures in Antarctica and prepare yourself to leave this world. And that is also just to say that a lot of the research that we're doing down there hasn't actually yet been published and will be over the next coming year. And also a lot of the experiences I had down there, I won't have time to talk about today. And you can access them all on the European Space Agency website through the Concordia blog. So I just want to give you a bit of an idea sort of who I am here talking to you today. So I'm a medical doctor. Before I went down to Concordia Station, I was working at Chelsea and Westminster Hospital in London in sort of emergency department. But I've always had a really big interest in extreme environments and extreme environment research. And this has led me to work as part of medical and logistical support teams up in the Arctic. So I've been sort of Greenland, Svalbard, Siberia, and also the North Pole before I went down south to Antarctica. So there's lots of different spaceflight analogs, and they're used by ESA, NASA, and other space agencies to perform either research or for astronaut training. So probably one of the most popular ones, and one that's been on the news recently, is to stay in bed for a few months, and that's to replicate microgravity. But we use these platforms to look at all sorts of different things. So we have underwater ones, for example, the NEMO project, and we've got ones which are in Hawaii, so we've got the High Seas project, and also another one called Mars 500. So Mars 500 was actually performed in a Russian car park, and 6 astronauts were selected to spend 500 days in a simulated Mars mission. And this was an amazing platform for research because we were able to control a number of different things and also incorporate lots of interesting aspects into the mission. So, for example, time delays with communication, emergencies, and actually doing full sort of EVA spacewalks when they sort of did the simulated arrival at the Martian landscape. And a lot of the experiments that we are doing at Concordia Station were an extension of these experiments. But the problem with a platform like Mars 500 is the fact that you actually have a door that you could walk through for the entirety of the experiment. And while having been down in Antarctica now, I think I would have found that a lot harder because I would have spent a lot of the time wondering whether or not I should or shouldn't leave the analog program. And while nobody actually left the Mars 500 project, it certainly put a different psychological pressure on the crew and also required different medical models. So Concordia, as an analog, is actually completely isolated for 9 months. And because of that, it makes it really interesting for research for long-duration spaceflight missions. So this is Concordia Station. It's situated on the Dome Charlie Plateau and is one of only 3 of the inland stations in Antarctica. It's actually at altitude, so it's about 3,300 meters, which gives it an alpine equivalent of just shy of 4,000, which makes it like living on the top of Mont Blanc for a year. But there's lots of other reasons other than the isolation which makes Concordia a really interesting place to do spaceflight research as well. And I'm just going to go through a few of them. So this is my Overwinter crew. We're a crew of 13 people. We're about a 50-50 mix of French and Italian. We also have myself, British, and a Swiss German as part of the crew. We're about a 50-50 mix of scientific and technical crew as well. And here was the first night of our Overwinter experience. I'm also a skeleton crew as well, and that means that we all have to take on different roles. So, for example, the plumber had learnt how to scrub into theatre, I'd learnt how to do fire exercises, and we all sort of contributed to these different roles, which is really important when you're part of a small team. We're also very isolated, but not only that, we were very confined to the base as well. So in Concordia, temperatures are typically around -80 during the winter time, which means that you're very confined to the base. And also the lifestyle is very monotonous. There's not much which changes in your day-to-day routine, and it's really important as a crew that we did make those changes. And what comes with confinement is also actually forced human interactions. So before I went down to Concordia, I thought that one of my biggest challenges would be sort of isolation and loneliness. But in fact, it's kind of the opposite, because you can't really get away from people in these kind of environments. You're also limited with what you can take down there, and also the time in which you can bring everything. So all the food, fuel, and equipment for the Overwinter arrives between November and February, and if you forget anything during that period, it's not possible to bring it in during the Overwinter. And that includes sort of medical supplies and also scientific equipment. And we certainly ran into a little bit of trouble with some of the experiments, just forgetting small, simple things which had been overlooked. You also have an abnormal day-night cycle. So during the long polar night, I didn't see the sun for over 105 days, and that puts a different pressure on people as well. And that was one of the things that we're looking at, and how that affected people's circadian rhythms. And it's also an extreme environment. So this is just a screenshot of a sort of typical day that you had during the Overwinter. So most notably, you can see that we've got a very low pressure, which is because of the altitude we're at, but also the temperatures are really low. So here we've got minus 81.4, and that's sort of ambient temperature. And with wind chill on top of that, it can actually get down to over minus 100. And with those kind of temperatures and environment, it also comes real danger, especially with the nighttime as well, because it's really difficult to see people outside. And also, we're not able to drive any machinery, so we have one big Caterpillar tractor for the entire winter. But if anybody runs into trouble, you're not able to sort of take an ambulance or a skidoo or anything to go and retrieve them. So it's all done sort of by foot and by manpower. And you're also there for a very long time. So I was actually in Antarctica for 14 months, and that's pretty typical of anybody looking to do an overwinter. We're in the isolation period for 9 months, and that was with the crew of 13. But either side of that, I had the Antarctic summers, which are actually a lot more busy. So you have about 105 people coming through the base during that period, doing all sorts of different scientific research. We also use water recycling at Concordia, and we actually helped to develop the technology which is now used up on the International Space Station. So this is an experiment in itself, which ESA are performing down there. And we also have sophisticated telemedicine. So if we're looking to go a little bit further than the International Space Station, we're going to have to change the medical models that we're using. And telemedicine is one way in which we can do that and overcome the fact that we're not able to evacuate people quickly. If somebody was to have a medical problem up on the International Space Station today, we could probably get them down by lunchtime this evening. But that's the one limitation of being in this kind of environment that we're not able to do. So now I'd like to just run a little bit through my experience and what it's like to live down in an Antarctic base like Concordia. So before we went, we had lots of training. So I went to lots of different institutes to learn about the different experimental protocols that we'd be running down on the base. So I had 7 experiments running in total, and that's pretty typical for a year at Concordia. I also went out to Chamonix and learned about mountain medicine training, sort of pre-hospital retrieval, and also had some Antarctica-specific training as well. And perhaps most interestingly, we also went to the European Astronaut Center, where we had what's called human behavior performance training. And that was about how to live and work together effectively as a crew. So here we are at the Astronaut Center, and this is the first time that we met as an overwintering crew. And this is actually at the Neutral Buoyancy Facility, which is where they run a lot of the training for underwater spacewalking. So how to learn to spacewalk, because you have the lower gravity. And this is the training that we had. And this is what it's like at the Astronaut Center. So you've got all the different training modules. So this is one of the big training modules that the astronauts use before they go up to the space station, so that they're familiar with all the techniques and machinery before they get there. And it's also quite fun as well. And here's astronaut Samantha Cristoforetti. She's actually an Italian astronaut, and she joined us through our journey. So when we were down in Antarctica, we had a Skype call with the International Space Station when Samantha was up there as well. And we were lucky enough to meet her sort of as a crew before and after our mission. And this is the Nbehab facility. So this is where a lot of the astronauts have all of their pre- and post-mission measurements taken. And it was also where we had all of ours done. It's situated in Cologne, right next to the European Astronaut Center, and it's a big research facility for specifically human measurements. Oh, sorry. So before we went, we had functional MRI scannings of our brain to look for any functional changes which might happen during the mission. And we had these before we went away, immediately post-mission, and again 6 months afterwards. We also had lots of other different tests, so all of our baseline measurements were taken at this time. And we also got to see the bed rest facility. So this is where they're performing all of the bed rest studies. But before long, it was time to go south. So this is actually going in the plane. So it's a Hercules plane that you use to get to Antarctica. And here I am. And then from the coast, you get a smaller twin otter plane. These are sort of the classic polar planes that you might see on movies of people going into Antarctica. And here I was, so it's 16,500 kilometers from home, and this is the summer, so it's pretty chilly. This is Adrianos Golemis, and he was actually my predecessor before I went down south. And he taught me lots of things about all the sort of experiments and how to live and work there, but probably one of the most important things as well for anybody considering doing an overwinter, and that is in fact how to play babyfoot. And then all of the food and fuel and equipment came on an overland traverse. So this happens twice during the summertime in Antarctica. And this is pretty much how all the equipment arrives for all the protocols that we were doing. There's also a lot of other experiments taking on during the summertime there. So Concordia is actually built where it is because of the Epica project. So it actually has the oldest ever drilling sort of ice core has been drilled at Concordia through the Epica. And here are where the Epica ice cores are actually stored as well. So, and the reason that's the case is because we don't have very much precipitation at Concordia, so it means that you don't have to drill down so far to go a long way back in time. And that's why a lot of the drilling sites are sort of situated on the central plateaus of Antarctica. And this is pretty much what it looks like everywhere. So it's very white and flat, and there's a lot of sensory deprivation because of that. And that's a big thing that people notice. So when they come back to sort of Australia and New Zealand, which is where we fly to from Antarctica, you really do notice all the smells and all the sensory stimulation, which you don't have in an environment like this. And again, it's a lot like spaceflight in that respect. And so this is quite a busy period during the summer. There's lots going on. There's lots of sport outside. So the French wear blue suits, the Italians wear red, which is pretty handy for any sports which take place. There's also lots of training as well to prepare us for the overwinter. So this is actually a fire escape, which we use. So it's pretty fun having a go at that and learning how to do sort of go down through this big sock thing. I think you can see there. And then it was time for us to leave. For the summer people to leave and for us to stay. So this was quite an emotional time. So this happened on the 7th of February last year. So saying goodbye to all the people that you met during the summer. So this is the last plane leaving. And then here we were, sort of left, just 13 of us for 9 months. And ESA often refer to us as the hibernauts, which in French just means sort of winter nauts. And now I'd like to welcome you to the ESA lab. So this was sort of my home for most of the time I was there. And I'd just like to run through some of the experiments that we're doing down there. So we're doing lots of different experiments, and I don't have, unfortunately, time to tell you sort of all about them here today. But as I said, if you do go on the website, you can get a lot more information about what's taking place, and the new ones which are just being started this overwinter as well. But this is one experiment that we're running, and we're running in collaboration with NASA. So as I mentioned already, we were taking the functional MRI scanning pre and post mission. But we're also wearing activity watches. And so these watches weren't just interesting in terms of looking at our activity levels, but also for our sleep-wake cycle. And perhaps more interestingly, they also had proximity sensing, which meant that we were able to detect how close people were to each other and where they were on the base. And from this, we were able to detect sort of relationships and how they were changing over time, and also tell a lot about team dynamics, and also how people were choosing to spend their time. So whether they were choosing to isolate themselves in their bedrooms or seek out sort of more social interaction, and how that was changing, and also looking for sort of critical time points in the mission where people might be more at risk of sort of isolating themselves. We're also running a 10-part cognition battery. So this is looking at lots of different areas. So for example, risk-taking behavior, memory skills, and sort of speed of reaction times. And this is a really interesting experiment because it shows how Concordia is also an extension of a lot of the experiments which are taking up place on the International Space Station at the moment as well. So the idea of this is that astronauts test themselves against themselves, and a dip in performance is simply a red flag for mission control to be sort of, why are they dipping in performance? Are there problems? Are they getting enough sleep? Do they have any sort of emotional problems at home? And so they're able to monitor them in this respect. And here you can see, and here you can see the beacon. So this is how we're actually detecting people on the base. So this is what was interacting with the activity watches. And here's my friend JP taking part in the cognition battery at Concordia. And here you can see Scott Kelly doing exactly the same cognition battery up on the International Space Station at the same time. Another experiment we're doing is called Koala. So this is doing video diaries. And from this, we weren't really interested in what people were actually saying, but sort of the non-verbal cues that we can pick up with the software that we were using. We're also doing an experiment called Backfinder, and this is looking for extremophile bacteria which is able to survive in an environment like Concordia. So Concordia is incredibly cold and has a lot of conditions which are similar to other planets, for example, Mars. And perhaps if we're able to find bacteria which can survive out here, because at the moment we've not found anything to be able to survive in this environment, it can help inform us of what we might be able to find on different planets as well. So we're taking snow samples throughout the winter and throughout the summer at Concordia. And here you can see sort of the winter samples taking place at the same area. We're testing in 3 different zones. So we're testing in sort of dirty zones, which are right next to the base. Other zones which we're looking at sort of areas where we walk in, but perhaps less frequently. And then clean, pristine, untouched areas as well, where nobody's ever walked before. And this is what it's like to take sort of these kind of samples during the middle of the winter. So it's pretty chilly. And I certainly learned a lot about sort of field skills and taking samples and doing experiments in these kind of environments from this experiment, because you do have to adapt to how you're collecting your samples. So for example, the first time I went out, sort of my notepad fell apart because the glue of the binding just completely disintegrated. The pen was completely frozen, and the meteorological testing equipment that I was using had run out of battery, all within sort of about 60 seconds. So you really do have to adapt the way that you're working to be able to get data in these environments. We're also looking at the effect of the low light levels on the crew, and more specifically the effect of using artificial lighting for a long period of time as well. And I really like this experiment because I think it highlights the fact that although a lot of the experiments we were doing, of course, were run for ESA, so it's looking towards space and spaceflight, but there's a lot that we can learn from that data back here on Earth as well. So, for example, people that are working in factories on night shifts and also exposed to large levels of artificial lighting will also benefit from the research that we're doing at a base like Concordia as well. And there's a lot from space research that we can learn which is useful for back here on Earth as well. We're also taking lots of samples, so this is just to say that there was a lot more going on than what I've had the opportunity to talk about today. Also looking at the effect of the hypoxia, and specifically sort of the chronic exposure to hypoxia. So we have a lot of studies which are looking at the acute phase hypoxia, but this was really interested in sort of how it's affecting us longer term. And this is an arterial blood gas machine that we had out there, and we're using capillary samples to measure that. And here you can see me at the gym. So this is right at the end of my mission, and I'm not sure if people are familiar with oxygen saturation probes, but typically you would expect somebody my age to have a saturation around 98% minimum, probably 100. And with saturations of 88%, I would certainly be admitting myself if I was to come into an emergency department. And so even after being at Concordia for over 14 months at this point, I was still saturating around 88% with just a little bit of exercise. So it really demonstrates how the oxygen was affecting us. And certainly just running up the stairs at the end of the mission, you really could tell that you were at altitude. We also have lots of experiments continuing. So this is the next ESA MD who's just finishing his overwinter at the moment. We've actually got the Soyuz spaceflight simulator down there as well. So we're looking at different training schedules and sort of our capacity to retain information over time and looking at optimizing that as well. So essentially asking the question, do we need to take a simulator with us on a Mars mission? Because are we going to forget how to land the Soyuz by the time we arrive at Mars? There's also a lot of other stuff happening at Concordia. So this is doing the medical training, and this is all the team helping me with that. So not necessarily sort of from a medical background. That brings different challenges, especially with the different language elements as well. I was also doing all the water recycling testing as well, so that's another big part of the role of ESA MD down there. But lots of my friends and family wonder why I would want to go down to a place like Concordia and Antarctica, and I'd just like to share with you some of the amazing experiences that I had the opportunity to see down there. So here you can see a little aurora on the left-hand side of one of the bases. This is our chef, Luca, and our chef was actually a really important part of our team, and I think we've learned from the Biohacking Summit here how important food is for people, and certainly in terms of morale as well. And so Luca was a really integral part of our team, and he was really brilliant because he had worked in loads of different countries, and so he's able to incorporate different cuisines. And this was actually sort of an English night that we had the opportunity to do. But interestingly, within our groups, a lot of us found that with the long polar night, it was hard to keep our circadian rhythms as per normal. And so we actually ended up enforcing lunch and dinner time to make sure that we were able to maintain communication between the crew during that time. Because otherwise, people were just slipping into their own different rhythms. And so the lunch and dinner became a really important time for us as a crew. In terms of communication, it's not that bad down in Concordia. So we don't have sort of Wi-Fi as we would here. But you do have internet access on sort of a few designated computers, and there is one Skype computer as well. And we also have WhatsApp down there as well, which is quite interesting, sort of new development. But I must say that I am a little bit on the fence as to whether that made it easier or harder. So we had a 2-month period where we didn't actually have any communications at all just because of a problem with the internet server. But it can be quite tough as well to have really good communication sort of with the outside world because it did make you a little bit more homesick as well. So I think, and it's also difficult because you can't control bad news which people are getting. So in the past in Concordia and sort of Antarctic bases in general, if there was to be a problem back home, it would sort of come through the station leader to the crew. And that's a lot like what it's like on the International Space Station as well. But now we don't have that same level of control, and so it's really difficult to know if your crewmates have had some bad news which they're not telling you about as well. So it sort of swings and roundabouts with that one. There's lots of other science taking place on the base as well. So this is JP taking some snow samples for a glaciology project, which we're doing down there too. We've got seismo caves as well. So this is sort of underneath the ice at Concordia. There's these big tunnels, which are pretty cool to get to go and visit. And we've also got lasers as well. So this is looking at the atmosphere. So these are called LiDARs. But this is what it really looked like all the time at Concordia during the long polar night. So this was taken around lunchtime, I think, and it was a photo that I took myself, and it really did look like this the entire time. The Milky Way was as clear as sort of day, really, and it was an amazing sight to see, and certainly was one of the big highlights for me going down there. I wasn't really much of a stargazer before I got to see things like this, and then I really sort of realized what all the fuss was about. We also saw the Southern Lights as well, which was an amazing opportunity. So this was the first one that I'd actually ever seen. It was just absolutely beautiful. And here you can see them as well, so sort of unreal. And you also get these sort of nice pinky purpley ones as well. But before long, it was time for the sun to come back, and this was a really emotional time for us, and it really made me realize how much energy you get from the sun. So when we lost it, it was kind of exciting because you had all the sort of night skies to see and the auroras, but it did make you feel like you're sort of in a small kind of hibernation mode. But really, when the sun came back, we're sort of all jumping around. I went to the gym for the first time for months, I think. And sort of the chef made a sun cake and we all had a party. And it really did sort of reconnect you back with the real world. So I think when we didn't have the sun, I really felt like sometimes that you could be on a different planet because the sun is that familiar thing that you see and sort of reconnects you with life. These are the smaller laboratories that we have outside at Concordia, and these are a safety element as well. So these are sort of heated laboratories, and it means that you're never too far away from the place of safety. So you kind of hop between these bases, but that's just a point of interest. And this is the plane coming back. So this is Jim. He's one of the pilots that works in Antarctica and been working there for a long time. And has got some amazing stories to tell. And he was actually involved in the recent evacuation from South Pole, which you might have heard of on the news. So I was pretty pleased that he didn't get lost on his way back to come and get us. And this is me actually on the day of the plane. So I was really excited to sort of get to see all the faces that had left us 9 months earlier. But it was a really interesting time as well because there were sort of very mixed feelings in terms of a lot of people felt very negative about sort of the winter ending and these people sort of coming to invade us. and sort of end our overwinter experience. So it's a really interesting time. And in fact, some people actually struggled with that transition phase as well. And it's quite interesting to see that some people sort of felt more at home during the overwinter period than they did perhaps going back into normal life as well. So it's interesting because I think that lots of the time people just assume that everybody wants the winter to end and sort of go back to normality, but that certainly wasn't the case for everybody amongst our crew. And this brings me to the last part of my story and my journey in Antarctica. So as part of the experiment called Backfinder, which was looking for the extreme bacteria which can survive outside, I actually had the opportunity to go on the Overland Traverse, which is the resupply traverse for Concordia. And this was an amazing opportunity in terms of scientific value because it meant that I was able to go to areas which had never previously been gone to in Antarctica, because you just had to walk a small sort of few steps away from this track to get into completely untouched, pristine landscape and take snow samples in areas which people had never walked in before, which was a really exciting thing to be involved in. So this was the route that we took. We went from, so I flew to Cap Prud'homme in a small twin-otter plane, and then drove back 1,300 kilometers along the Dome Charlie Plateau back to Concordia, taking samples along the way. And I'd like to take a moment here really as well just to acknowledge all the people that are working in Antarctica who make all this research and a reality, in fact. And it's a lot like space research in so much that there's a huge teams working behind the astronauts which are going up into space. And likewise in Antarctica, there's all these people who are working on all the logistics which make all the research that we're doing actually possible. And these are some of the people that I was privileged enough to get the opportunity to go and work with. So this is my crew. And this is Jackie. So he actually taught me how to drive a caterpillar tractor, which I thought was pretty brave of him. So we sort of went for 2 hours just driving around in these huge cat tractors. He put a learner sticker on the back, and then away we went on the mission. So he's pretty cool French guy. And here I am actually sort of changing the caterpillar track on one of the snow plows. So it's not all glamorous being sort of ESA doctor. You do have to get stuck in as well. And these are the tractors that we drove in. And this is what it looks like pretty much. So these are sort of big fuel containers that we're using to transport the fuel back to Concordia. Here's an obligatory selfie inside the caterpillar tractor. And this is how I spent New Year's last year as well. So you can see that there's two big tractors. You're connected by a big piece of rope, and then you have all of the sort of equipment behind you. This is actually my tractor number 6. And this is what happens when you go off the track. So you have these big snow plows which make a really nice track for us, but sometimes it sort of the loads shift off the track. So the French say it was the Italians say it was the French. As long as it was the Brit, I didn't really mind. So this is one of the troubles that we ran into. And then it was time to go home. So I actually came back to Christchurch by boat. And that was the end of my journey. So I don't know if you've got any questions about what I was doing down there.
Yeah. Also be pretty extreme. So how cold is it in the summertime, and how does it affect the human being that the sun is up all the time, that there is no night at all? It must be completely extreme even compared to Lapland.
Yeah, so during the summertime, you're looking at about minus 30. I think minus 25 was the warmest that I saw at Concordia specifically. It's quite a dry cold, so although it's minus 30, you could often go outside with not many layers. I think you might have noticed in one of the pictures in the summer, people don't always wear gloves, even though it is sort of obviously a very cold absolute temperature. In terms of the sunlight, I'm actually quite used to being up in sort of Arctic environments, and it's never personally really affected me very much. So I went down to Concordia being relatively smug and so much that I thought I'd be absolutely fine when we lost the sun as well, because normally I don't have any problems with sleep. But in fact, I actually find it a much bigger difference losing the sun than actually having the 24-hour daylight, because with the 24-hour daylight, it is possible to sort of artificially cut it out with sort of using blinds and iPads, whereas I don't feel that you can really effectively replicate the sun actually being there, even though we did use sort of side lamps and sort of artificial methods. It was a lot more difficult to get that same kind of stimulation. So for me, definitely, long polar night was a lot harder than the 24-hour sunlight. But it is kind of weird, like welcoming New Year's Eve with like 24-hour daylight as well. It's a strange environment to be in, but it certainly in terms of sleep-wake cycle, it didn't really affect the crew. It was much more regulated during that time.
One question.
Yeah.
How hard was it to adapt to Antarctica environment, and how hard was it to adapt when you got back home?
Okay, so the question was how hard is it to adapt to the Antarctic environment, and then sort of how hard is it to adapt coming back to real life, I think. So in answer to the question, I was quite used to sort of polar environments already. So in that respect, I think arriving, it felt a lot more normal for me because I'd had that previous experience. But I know that a lot of people who hadn't. So one chap, in fact, had never even left France. And he left France to go to Antarctica, which I thought was a pretty impressive and brave thing to do. And so for some people, it was a huge shock to sort of go to those kind of environments when you've never had any experience of that before. Having said that, I think it's surprising how quickly things can become normal. It's like when you go on holiday or sort of to other continents and other environments. Within a few days, you do kind of just sort of get used to it, really, and it does soon sort of feel like home. And it became weird to sort of the idea of not going out with all your polar gear and not seeing snow all the time. But certainly you did start to miss a lot of the things that you have back here and a lot of your friends and family as well. I think for me, coming back was probably the bigger shock, because when we had all the human behavior performance training, a lot of the time they commented on how we might struggle coming back to sort of normal life. And I always sort of really dismissed that. I didn't think that it would affect me because, you don't think it will really, but actually in reality I find that a lot harder, and it's just quite tiring because you sort of have to relearn how to do everything. So you become quite institutionalized in a base like Concordia. So for example, you have a chef, you don't have to use money at all. And in that respect, it's like the ultimate social experiment. You don't buy any clothes, you have everything you need for all that time, and all you really have to focus on is your work there. And suddenly when you come back to sort of normal life, you suddenly have to learn how to drive again, remember what your PIN code was, connect your phone back up to sort of your network, and all those little things which we take for granted in day-to-day life become a bit harder to do. And even just going to the shop and buying stuff, it's sort of, you have to kind of think about what you're doing. And also socially as well, you do become a little bit shyer, I think, and it took me a while to sort of get back into the swing of things. But all of this was fairly temporary, so I'd say within a month I was sort of back on track, really. But certainly it did affect me, and I think it affected a lot of people who had the same experience. Yeah.
Thank you very much for amazing presentation, and in general, I think that that kind of experience, it deserves a huge respect. Being there and experiencing all these things, for us, for people that have no kind of connection to that type of experiences, this is very impressive, and I think we should maybe give a round of applause once more time for this amazing things that you are doing. But the question then is, from your experience, what was the most difficult task? To manage the social communication, to stand the nature, to stand the temperature, to stand the scare of resources. What was the most difficult experience? And one more part of this question, what was your personal motivation to go that far and to spend that long period of time? Thank you.
In terms of personal motivation, I'd spent a lot of time up in the Arctic, and I'd met a lot of people who had worked down in Antarctica, and it was always, because of that, it's always been somewhere that I was really interested to go to. And also, I was just really fascinated by all the research which is taking place down at Concordia and on these spaceflight analogs. So it was really sort of the combination of getting to go to Antarctica and also being involved in the research down there, which is sort of why I went. In terms of difficulties, I mean, it is a challenge in that kind of environment, but certainly I think it's more the isolation and confinement side of things, which is the bigger challenge for people. And even being sort of young, fit, healthy, we have a lot of psychological testing and also medical testing before we go down, so you know that you're in pretty good shape. I think it is quite tough to know that if you do have a problem, you are completely isolated for those 9 months. And certainly you could tell from people that risk-taking behavior was affected as well. So during the summer, I think people were a lot more gung-ho when you knew that there was a plane that could potentially evacuate you if you were to have a problem. Certainly a lot of that changed as soon as that plane left and we knew that we were completely isolated. And it is something that's always in the back of your mind. I mean, as I mentioned with something like Mars 500, perhaps I would have found that harder because you would have had the opportunity to leave, which I think psychologically presents itself with a much bigger battle in terms of should I, shouldn't I leave. But certainly the isolation also brings its own challenges as well. And sometimes, you know, you did think, wow, like I really can't leave even if I wanted to. So I guess that's the hardest thing of Concordia, and certainly that challenge is much bigger than potentially the environmental challenge that a place like Concordia can bring. And that's certainly what a lot of the ESA research is really focused on, rather than sort of the absolute temperature. It's more the isolation and confinement element that Concordia has.